Good day. I am pleased to present my family, my wife, and our children. We are delighted you could join us.
The cardboard box sat on Rebecca's kitchen table for 3 days before she found the courage to open it. Her grandmother had passed away in September 2024, and the executor of the estate had delivered this final package with a handwritten note. She wanted you to have these. Said you'd understand when the time came. Rebecca ran her fingers over the yellowed tape, feeling the weight of years pressing down through the cardboard. At 34, she had built a career as a historical researcher at Emory University, specializing in women's social movements in the American South. Her grandmother had always supported her work, slipping her old letters and newspaper clippings whenever they met, whispering stories that never made it into official records. The autumn sunlight filtered through her apartment windows in the Virginia Highland neighborhood, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. Rebecca finally pulled the tape free and lifted the lid. Inside, dozens of photographs lay carefully wrapped in tissue paper, organized by decade. Some she recognized from her grandmother's mantelpiece weddings, birthdays, family gatherings spanning generations. But beneath the familiar images, she found a separate envelope marked with a single word in her grandmother's shaky handwriting, 1887. Her pulse quickened as she slid the contents onto the table. A single photograph, larger than the others, sepia-toned and remarkably well-preserved. The image showed a family of 7 posed in front of a wooden house, the kind of formal portrait common in the late 19th century. A severe-looking man stood at the center, his hand resting on an ornate chair. Around him, 3 women in dark, high-collared dresses sat rigidly, their faces expressionless. 2 young boys stood at the edges, their eyes fixed on the camera with that peculiar intensity of children forced to remain still. But it was the 4th woman, seated slightly apart from the others, who seized Rebecca's attention. Her face was turned 3/4 toward the camera, and even across 137 years, the evidence was unmistakable. Dark bruising spread across her left cheekbone, extending to her temple. Her lower lip appeared swollen, and her right eye seemed slightly narrowed, as if the surrounding tissue had recently been injured. Yet everyone posed as if nothing were wrong. Rebecca couldn't stop staring at the photograph. She carried it to her study, placed it under her desk lamp, and examined every detail through a magnifying glass. The bruising on the woman's face wasn't a trick of light or a flaw in the photographic process. It was real, unmistakable, and deliberately left visible. Why would a family commission a formal portrait, an expensive undertaking in 1887, and allow such evidence to remain in the frame? Portraits were carefully staged events, often requiring families to hold uncomfortable poses for several seconds while the camera captured the image. Everyone would have seen the injuries. Yet no one had postponed the sitting or suggested the woman position herself to hide the damage. She flipped the photograph over. On the back, written in faded ink, were 5 names: Thomas, Catherine, Elizabeth, Sarah, Margaret. No surnames, no location, no photographer's mark. Below the names, someone had written a date, March 14th, 1887. Rebecca opened her laptop and began searching historical records. Without surnames or locations, the task felt impossible, but she had learned long ago that patient research often revealed patterns. She started with photographic studios operating in Georgia in 1887, cross-referencing them with census records and city directories. Hours passed. The afternoon light faded, and Atlanta's evening traffic hummed outside her window. Rebecca made notes, followed dead ends, circled back to promising leads. Then, in a digitized archive from the Atlanta History Center, she found something, a newspaper advertisement from March 1887 for J. Whitman's Photographic Studio Family Portraits of Distinction. The address placed it in downtown Atlanta, near what was then the center of the city's commercial district. She searched for more references to Whitman's studio and discovered a small article from the Atlanta Constitution dated April 1887. The piece discussed the studio's closure following circumstances of a distressing nature. No details were provided, but the timing, just weeks after the date on her photograph, seemed significant. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She thought about her grandmother's note. You'd understand when the time came. What had her grandmother wanted her to find? And why had this photograph been kept separate from all the others, marked and preserved with such obvious care? That night, Rebecca dreamed of the woman in the photograph walking out of the frame, leaving an empty space behind. Michael's office at Georgia State University occupied a corner of the history department, its walls lined with reference books and filing cabinets containing decades of research materials. He cleared a space on his desk as Rebecca entered, setting down his coffee and adjusting the angle of his examination lamp. "Let's see what you've brought me," he said, pulling on a pair of white cotton gloves. Rebecca placed the photograph carefully on the desk. Michael leaned forward, his expression shifting from casual interest to focused concentration within seconds. He said nothing for a long moment, studying the image through a jeweler's loupe, then switching to a high-powered magnifying device mounted on an adjustable arm. "This is extraordinary," he finally said. "The clarity, the preservation, it's museum quality, but that's not what has you concerned, is it?" "Look at the woman on the right, seated separately." Michael adjusted the magnification and examined her face closely. His jaw tightened. "Those are impact injuries. Recent ones, maybe a day or two old when this was taken. The swelling suggests..." He paused, his professional detachment slipping slightly. "This must have been extremely painful. And yet she's sitting for a formal portrait. That's what I can't understand," Rebecca said. "Why would they proceed with the photograph?" Michael flipped the image over and read the names on the back. "No surnames, which is unusual. Formal portraits typically included full identifications for family records." He examined the edges of the photograph, the paper stock, the chemical residue. This was developed using the gelatin silver process common for the period. The studio work is professional expensive, actually. This wasn't a cheap sitting. He pulled out his laptop and opened a database of 19th century photographic techniques. The pose arrangement is interesting. See how the injured woman is separated from the others? In formal Victorian portraiture, physical proximity indicated family hierarchy and relationships. Wives sat beside husbands, children clustered near parents. But she's isolated, set apart by at least 2 feet. Rebecca felt a chill, as if she didn't belong, or was being excluded, or being marked as different somehow. Michael magnified the image further, focusing on the background. "Look here, behind the family. Do you see this?" Rebecca leaned in. Partially visible through a window in the house behind them, she could make out what appeared to be another woman's figure, watching from inside. "There was someone else," she whispered. Rebecca returned home with more questions than answers. She made tea and sat at her kitchen table, the photograph now encased in an archival sleeve Michael had provided. The late afternoon sun cast the same light as when she'd first opened the box, and she felt the circular nature of her investigation always returning to this image. This moment frozen in 1887. She decided to search through the rest of her grandmother's box more carefully. Perhaps there were other documents, other clues she'd missed in her initial examination. She removed each photograph slowly, checking the backs for inscriptions, looking for any connection to the 1887 portrait. Near the bottom of the box, tucked between 2 layers of tissue paper, she found a sealed envelope. It was modern, not antique, and bore her name in her grandmother's handwriting. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were 3 pages of lined notebook paper, filled with her grandmother's careful script. The letter was dated 2 months before her grandmother's death. "My dearest Rebecca, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you found the photograph I've kept hidden for 60 years. I'm sorry for the burden I'm placing on you, but you're the only one in our family who will understand why this matters, why the truth must finally be told. The woman in that photograph is my grandmother Sarah. I never met her. She died in 1892, just 5 years after that portrait was taken. But my mother told me her story, made me promise to remember it, and I'm passing that promise to you now. Sarah wasn't born in Georgia. She came from North Carolina in 1885, fleeing a violent marriage. She had no money, no family to support her, and no legal right to divorce her husband. Women like her had few options then. Most returned to their abusive homes or ended up destitute on the streets. But Sarah found something different. She found the others." Rebecca paused, her heart racing. The letter continued. There was a house in Atlanta on the east side of the city, run by a woman named Catherine. Officially, it was a boarding house for working women. Unofficially, it was a refuge. Catherine took in women fleeing violence, women with nowhere else to go. She gave them shelter, found them work, protected them from husbands and fathers who came looking. The photograph you found was taken in front of that house. Those women, Catherine, Elizabeth, Margaret, they were Sarah's protectors. The next morning, Rebecca drove to the Georgia Archives in Morrow, a repository of state records dating back to the colonial period. She signed in at the research room and requested all court records from Fulton County for 1887, specifically any cases involving domestic disputes, property rights, or assault charges. The archivist, a woman named Patricia, raised her eyebrows. That's a substantial request. These records weren't digitized systematically, so you'll be working with the original documents. Are you looking for something specific? Rebecca explained her research, showing Patricia a photocopy of the 1887 portrait. The archivist studied it carefully, then nodded slowly. I remember seeing something about a boarding house case from that era. Give me a few minutes. Patricia returned 20 minutes later with 3 archival boxes. These contain Fulton County Superior Court records from 1887. If there was a legal case involving your family, it should be here. Rebecca spent the next 4 hours carefully examining handwritten court documents. She found property disputes, business disagreements, criminal cases, and finally, in the third box, a file labeled Pierce v. Marshall, March 1887. Her breath caught. The plaintiff was listed as Robert Pierce, residing in Raleigh, North Carolina. The defendant, Catherine Marshall, proprietress of the Marshall House, Atlanta, Georgia. She began reading the case file with trembling hands. Robert Pierce had filed suit demanding the return of his wife, Sarah Pierce, whom he claimed was being held against her will at Catherine's boarding house. He alleged that Catherine had unlawfully enticed and harbored his wife, interfering with his marital rights. The file contained Sarah's counter-testimony, sworn before a judge on March 18, 1887, 4 days after the photograph was taken. Rebecca read her words, preserved in the court clerk's formal hand. I fled my husband's house in fear for my life. He had beaten me repeatedly over 3 years of marriage. When I arrived in Atlanta, Mrs. Catherine Marshall provided me shelter and employment. My husband followed me here and attempted to remove me by force. He struck me in the face and threatened my life. Mrs. Marshall and her household prevented him from taking me. I wished to remain here of my own free will. Attached to Sarah's testimony was the photograph submitted as Exhibit A, physical evidence of violence and Sarah's right to refuse to return. Rebecca continued reading through the court file, her hands trembling as she turned each yellowed page. The case had attracted significant attention in Atlanta. Newspaper clippings tucked into the file showed headlines: Wife refuses husband's custody. Boarding house matron defends refuge for women. Pierce case tests marital rights law. Supporting documents filled the file. A physician's report, signed by a Dr. Howard, cataloged Sarah's injuries in clinical detail. Contusions to the left zygomatic region, periorbital edema, laceration of the lower lip, evidence of previous healed fractures to the ribs. The doctor's testimony stated that these injuries were consistent with repeated physical assault over an extended period. Witness statements from Elizabeth, Margaret, and Thomas Marshall described the night Robert Pierce had come to the boarding house. He had forced his way through the front door, shouting for Sarah. When she refused to leave, he struck her twice in the face before Thomas and the women physically restrained him and summoned the police. The photograph, noted the court clerk, had been provided by James Whitman, Catherine's brother, who operated a photographic studio in the city. He had taken the portrait 4 days after the assault, deliberately documenting Sarah's visible injuries before they could heal. The judge's decision, issued in April 1887, was revolutionary for its time. Rebecca read it 3 times, absorbing every word. While marital law generally recognizes the husband's authority over his wife's person and residence, this court cannot ignore evidence of grievous bodily harm and credible fear for life. The photographic evidence presented demonstrates beyond reasonable doubt that Mrs. Sarah Pierce has suffered severe physical abuse at the hands of her husband. Under such circumstances, the law's protection of marital rights must yield to the more fundamental right of personal safety. This court therefore rules that Mrs. Pierce has legal grounds to refuse to return to her husband's custody and grants her the right to remain in Georgia under the protection of Mrs. Catherine Marshall. Patricia appeared at Rebecca's shoulder. You found it. The Marshall House case. Do you know what happened afterward? Rebecca looked up. What do you mean? That case changed Georgia law. 6 months later, the state legislature passed new provisions allowing women to seek legal separation on grounds of physical cruelty. It started with this case, with that photograph. Rebecca sat in the archives conference room, surrounded by documents she'd requested after Patricia's revelation. The Marshall House case had opened a door into a hidden world, and she was determined to understand its full scope. She found references to Catherine Marshall in city directories, tax records, and business registries. Catherine had operated the boarding house from 1884 to 1891, providing lodging for working women and those in need of temporary accommodation. The property records showed Thomas Marshall as the legal owner, but notations indicated Catherine managed all operations. What became clear through careful cross-referencing was that the Marshall House wasn't an isolated operation. Rebecca discovered mentions of similar establishments in other cities, a boarding house in Savannah run by a woman named Florence, another in Macon operated by someone called Harriet. Letters in the state archives, preserved in various unrelated collections, mention these places in careful, coded language. Rooms available for women of good character. Refuge for those seeking honest employment. They had created a network, Rebecca realized. An underground system helping women escape violent homes, find work, and establish independent lives. In an era when women had few legal rights and limited means of earning independent income, these boarding houses had provided lifelines. She found more newspaper accounts of the Pierce case and its aftermath. The Atlanta Constitution had initially treated it as sensational gossip, but as the case progressed, the tone shifted. Editorial columns began discussing women's safety and marital rights. Letters to the editor appeared, some supporting Sarah and Catherine, others condemning them as threats to family order. One letter, published in May 1887 and signed simply, "A friend of justice," caught Rebecca's attention. The verdict in the Pierce matter demonstrates that even the law, designed by men for men, cannot ignore the evidence of brutality when confronted with it. Mrs. Marshall and her associates have performed a service to our city by providing shelter to women in desperate circumstances. Those who condemn them might ask themselves, what would you have these women do? The Marshall House offers dignity, safety, and hope. Patricia returned with another box. After the Pierce case, several women filed similar suits seeking legal separation. The cases cite Pierce v. Marshall as precedent. Rebecca opened the box and began examining the cases. Between 1887 and 1895, 17 women in Fulton County had successfully petitioned for legal separation on grounds of cruelty. Rebecca couldn't let Sarah's disappearance from the records remain a mystery. She expanded her search, looking beyond Atlanta's official records. She checked church registries, employment records from textile mills, and membership lists for women's charitable organizations. In the records of a Presbyterian church in the Inman Park neighborhood, she found an entry from 1888. New member, Sarah Pierce, residing at the Marshall House, occupation, seamstress. Sarah had stayed in Atlanta, remained at the boarding house, and found work. Rebecca traced church records forward year by year. Sarah appeared in membership lists through 1892, always with the same occupation and address. Then, in 1893, the entry changed: Sarah Blackwell, married to Mr. Henry Blackwell, residing on Highland Avenue. Rebecca's pulse quickened. Sarah had remarried. She returned to court records and found the answer in an 1892 filing. Robert Pierce had died in North Carolina in 1891. Sarah had been legally free to remarry. She searched for information about Henry Blackwell and discovered he'd been a school teacher in Atlanta, active in educational reform movements and supportive of women's suffrage progressive for his time. City directories showed the couple living at various Atlanta addresses through 1920. Then, she found the census record that changed everything. In the 1900 federal census, Henry and Sarah Blackwell were listed with 3 children, and one notation made Rebecca's heart stop. Also residing in household, Catherine Marshall, sister-in-law. Sarah had married Catherine's brother. The family that had protected her had become her actual family. Catherine had spent her final years living with Sarah and Henry, helping raise their children. Rebecca found one more crucial record: Sarah's death certificate from 1922, listing her age as 57 and her occupation as homemaker and women's advocate. The certificate noted she was survived by 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and numerous women whom she assisted through her work with the Atlanta Women's Shelter. Sarah had continued the work. After Catherine's death, after her own children were grown, Sarah had dedicated herself to helping other women escape violence. The network hadn't ended with Catherine. It had evolved, expanded, continued. Rebecca felt tears on her cheeks. Her grandmother's letter had said to look for what came after, and now she understood. What came after was generations of women helping other women, a chain of protection stretching from 1887 to the present day. Rebecca knew this story couldn't remain buried in archives. She spent 2 weeks compiling her research into a comprehensive historical narrative, documenting every source, every connection, every piece of evidence. She scanned all the original documents, cross-referenced them with existing scholarship on women's history in the South, and built a timeline showing how the Marshall House case had influenced legal reforms across Georgia. Then she drafted a proposal and sent it to the Atlanta History Center. Within 3 days, she received a phone call from Dr. Jennifer Williams, the center's curator of social history. "Your research is extraordinary," Jennifer said, her voice warm with excitement. We've had fragments of this story in our collections for years, but no one had connected all the pieces. The photograph, the network of boarding houses, Sarah's continuation of the work Rebecca. This changes our understanding of women's activism in post-Reconstruction Atlanta. They met the following week. Jennifer brought 2 other curators, and together they discussed how to present the story. The center wanted to create a focused display, part of their ongoing exhibition on Atlanta's hidden histories. We want the photograph to be central, Jennifer explained. But we also want to tell the broader story, the legal case, the network, the women who came after Sarah. Can we include copies of the court documents? Absolutely, Rebecca said. And I have something else. She showed them her grandmother's letter. This is why the story survived. I'd like that to be part of the display too, showing how family memory preserves what official history erases. The curators agreed enthusiastically. They scheduled the display to open in February 2025. Rebecca would give a public lecture about her research, and the History Center would publish an accompanying article in their quarterly journal. As they worked through the details, Jennifer raised an important question. Have you tried to find Sarah's descendants? They might have additional materials, photographs, stories. Rebecca spent the next several days building a family tree. Sarah and Henry's 3 children had all married and had children of their own. The family had spread across Georgia and beyond. Rebecca began reaching out through genealogy websites, carefully explaining her research. The responses came slowly at first, then in a flood. Relatives sent photos, letters, diaries, pieces of Sarah's life that enriched the story beyond anything Rebecca had imagined. The display opened on a cold Saturday morning in February 2025. Rebecca arrived early, her stomach tight with nervous anticipation. The History Center had transformed a gallery space into an intimate exhibition titled, Hidden in Plain Sight, The Marshall House and Women's Resistance in Victorian Atlanta. The 1887 photograph dominated the entry wall, enlarged to poster size. Beneath it, a placard explained its significance as crucial evidence in a landmark legal case that changed Georgia law. Surrounding the main photograph were the court documents, newspaper clippings, and additional images Rebecca had uncovered. One wall displayed Sarah's later life, her marriage to Henry Blackwell, her work with the Atlanta Women's Shelter, and photographs of her in her 60s, surrounded by younger women who'd sought her help. Rebecca's grandmother's letter was mounted in a place of honor, explaining how the story had been preserved through family memory. As the doors opened, visitors began flowing in. Rebecca watched people's reactions. Many stopped abruptly when they saw Sarah's injuries, their faces registering shock and then understanding as they read the context. Lisa, Sarah's great-great-granddaughter, arrived with her 2 teenage daughters. They stood together before the enlarged portrait, Lisa explaining who each person was, sharing family stories that had been passed down through generations. My grandmother told me we came from strong women, Lisa said to Rebecca. But I never knew the full story, never understood just how brave they were. Throughout the day, more of Sarah's descendants arrived. They brought their own photographs, letters, and stories, creating an impromptu gathering around the display. Rebecca gave her public lecture to a packed auditorium, walking the audience through her research process from finding the photograph to uncovering the network of boarding houses and the legal precedent that had emerged. This photograph matters, Rebecca concluded, not just as historical evidence, but as a reminder that women have always resisted violence, always protected each other, always fought for justice, even when the law didn't support them. Catherine, Sarah, Elizabeth, Margaret, they created change not by asking permission, but by acting, by documenting truth, and by refusing to let violence remain hidden. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Rebecca felt tears on her cheeks as she looked out at the crowd. Historians, activists, descendants, and people simply moved by the story of courage that had echoed through 137 years.